Deep in the Amazon rainforest, where ancient trees guard deadly secrets, a family's dream vacation becomes their worst nightmare. When Sofia and Isabella Sandoval vanish without a trace, their disappearance is dismissed as a tragic accident. But Lucas refuses to accept the official story. Armed with only a father's desperate love and a mysterious envelope containing coordinates to nowhere, he ventures into the green hell where corruption runs deeper than the jungle roots. What he discovers will shatter everything he believed about justice, survival, and the lengths a family will go to save each other. Some silences hide the darkest truths. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The Amazon rainforest possessed a sound that Lucas Sandoval would carry with him until his dying breath. The haunting melody of absolute silence. It was not the absence of noise that tormented him, but rather the overwhelming presence of every whisper, every rustle, every distant cry that seemed to mock his desperate search. 3 months had crawled by like wounded animals since Sofia and Isabella had vanished into the green abyss, and each passing day felt like a knife slowly twisting deeper into his chest. The morning air hung thick with moisture as Lucas stood on the wooden deck of his temporary shelter, a ramshackle cabin he had rented on the outskirts of the jungle. His calloused hands gripped the weathered railing, knuckles white with the force of his desperation. The coffee in his chipped ceramic mug had long since grown cold, forgotten in the consuming weight of his thoughts. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, testament to countless sleepless nights spent staring at maps, photographs, and police reports that led nowhere. The official search had been called off exactly 73 days ago. Lucas had counted every single one. Commander Ramirez, with his perfectly pressed uniform and cold, calculating eyes, had delivered the news with bureaucratic precision. A sudden flood, he had claimed, pointing to meteorological data on his tablet screen. Natural disaster. Acts of God. Nothing anyone could have prevented or predicted. Case closed. But Lucas knew better. His engineering mind, trained to analyze patterns and identify anomalies, detected inconsistencies in every official report. The weather data showed only light rainfall in the region during the time of their disappearance. The tour guide's background check revealed gaps that made no sense. The tour company's permits had expired months before the expedition, yet no one seemed to care about this glaring oversight. The silence of the forest seemed to press against his eardrums as he remembered Sofia's last message. Her voice had been cheerful, excited even, as she described the breathtaking beauty of the canopy, the exotic birds that Isabella had spotted through her binoculars. There had been no hint of danger, no tremor of fear in her words. Just a mother and daughter sharing an adventure, completely unaware that they were walking into a nightmare. Lucas closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember Sofia's laugh, the way it bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, infectious and pure. Isabella's giggle always followed, higher pitched and more musical, like wind chimes dancing in a gentle breeze. These sounds haunted him now, echoing through the oppressive quiet of the jungle that had swallowed them whole. The wooden planks beneath his bare feet creaked as he shifted his weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a howler monkey released its territorial call, a deep, guttural roar that rolled through the trees like thunder. But even this wild proclamation of life felt hollow to Lucas, a reminder that the forest continued its ancient rhythms while his world had stopped completely. His smartphone buzzed against the wooden surface where he had placed it, the vibration startling him from his reverie. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Perhaps it was news. Perhaps someone had found something. But the screen showed only another message from his brother in São Paulo, asking when he planned to return to work, to reality, to the life that no longer held any meaning. The local post office was a 20-minute walk through the humid morning air, past houses with corrugated metal roofs and walls painted in faded tropical colors. Lucas had made this journey every day for weeks, driven by a desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, a message would find its way to him. The postmaster, an elderly man named Carlos with kind eyes and patient hands, had grown accustomed to Lucas's daily visits. He would shake his head gently, his weathered face creased with sympathy, indicating once again that nothing had arrived. But today was different. Carlos emerged from behind the counter with unusual hesitancy, his movements careful and deliberate. In his hands was a small envelope, unremarkable except for the complete absence of any return address or postal markings. Lucas's name was written across the front in block letters, each character formed with deliberate precision, as if the writer had wanted to ensure there would be no mistake about its intended recipient. Lucas's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force that he could feel his pulse in his temples. The paper was ordinary, the kind that could be purchased at any store, offering no clues about its origin. But inside, folded with the same careful precision as the handwriting, was a single sheet containing nothing but a series of numbers. Coordinates that meant nothing to most people but everything to a man who had spent months studying every inch of the surrounding terrain. The coordinates pointed to a location deep within the jungle, far from any established trails or tourist routes. It was not a place where casual hikers would venture, not somewhere that appeared on any of the official search maps that Commander Ramirez had shown him. As Lucas stared at the numbers, his mind began calculating distances, elevations, and access routes with the methodical precision that had once served him well in his software engineering career. This was not a ransom demand. There was no mention of money, no threats, no instructions. It was simply a point on the map, as mysterious as it was specific. But for Lucas, drowning in months of unanswered questions and dead-end investigations, it represented something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. The walk back to his cabin felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Every step brought him closer to a decision that would change everything. He could ignore the message, dismiss it as the cruel joke of someone who knew about his tragedy. He could turn it over to the authorities, though his faith in their competence had long since evaporated. Or he could do what every instinct in his body was screaming at him to do: follow the coordinates into the heart of the jungle, armed with nothing but his determination and the unshakable belief that Sophia and Isabella were still alive, still waiting for him to find them. The forest seemed to lean in around him as he walked, as if it were listening to his thoughts, measuring his resolve. Birds called to one another in languages older than human civilization, and somewhere in the green shadows, life and death danced their eternal ballet. But Lucas no longer heard just the silence that had tormented him for 3 months. Now, beneath the symphony of the jungle, he heard something else: the faint but unmistakable sound of possibility, calling him deeper into the unknown. The journey to the coordinates would test every fiber of Lucas's being, pushing him beyond limits he never knew existed. At dawn, he met his hired guide at the edge of the settlement, a weathered man named Miguel, whose sun-baked skin told stories of decades spent navigating the jungle's treacherous paths. Miguel's eyes held the cautious wisdom of someone who had seen too many outsiders underestimate the forest's power. But something in Lucas's desperate determination seemed to earn a grudging respect. The first river crossing came within an hour of departure. The water ran dark as coffee, its surface deceptively calm while dangerous currents lurked beneath. Miguel fashioned a makeshift rope bridge using vines and fallen branches, his movements efficient and practiced. Lucas followed, his urban softened hands immediately blistering against the rough fibers. Each step across the swaying bridge felt like a negotiation with gravity itself, the muddy water rushing 10 feet below, hungry for any mistake. The jungle closed around them like a living cathedral, its canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The air grew heavier with each mile, saturated with moisture that clung to their skin like a second layer of clothing. Lucas's shirt, already soaked with sweat, began to chafe against his shoulders and back. His designer hiking boots, purchased hastily in São Paulo, proved woefully inadequate for the terrain. With each step through the sucking mud and tangled undergrowth, he could feel blisters forming, then bursting, then forming again. Miguel moved through the vegetation like a shadow, barely disturbing the leaves as he passed. Lucas, by contrast, crashed through with the subtlety of a wounded elephant, branches catching his backpack, thorns tearing at his exposed arms. Insects swarmed around them in clouds, mosquitoes that seemed to bite through clothing, tiny black flies that targeted the corners of his eyes, and something that buzzed with the fury of miniature chainsaws. The second day brought new torments. A family of spider monkeys followed them for miles, their haunting calls echoing through the trees like the voices of lost souls. Lucas found himself constantly looking up, searching the canopy for any glimpse of familiar movement, any sign that might indicate human presence. But there was only the endless green maze, indifferent to his suffering and hope in equal measure. On the third morning, Miguel suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. Through a gap in the trees, Lucas could see a small clearing bathed in golden morning light. His heart began to race as they approached the coordinates. This was it. The place that had called to him across impossible distances, the location that represented his last thread of hope. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across, carpeted with fallen leaves that released a rich, earthy scent with each footstep. But as Lucas's eyes adjusted to the brighter light, his soaring hopes began to plummet like a bird shot from the sky. There was no camp, no signs of recent human habitation, no indication that Sophia and Isabella had ever been here. Instead, scattered around the perimeter of the clearing were the remnants of what appeared to be an old campsite, possibly months or even years abandoned. A tattered piece of blue tarp hung from a low branch, faded by sun and rain until it was barely recognizable. Nearby, a rusted tin can lay on its side, its label long since rotted away. The remains of a fire pit sat in the center of the clearing, nothing more than a circle of blackened stones surrounding cold ashes that had been scattered by countless rainstorms. Lucas felt his knees buckle as the full weight of disappointment crashed over him. He sank to the ground among the dead leaves, his hands shaking uncontrollably. For 3 months, he had clung to the belief that every step forward was bringing him closer to his family. Now, surrounded by the detritus of strangers who had passed through this place long ago, he felt farther from Sophia and Isabella than ever before. Miguel watched from the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable but not unkind. He had guided many searching souls into the jungle over the years, and he recognized the particular anguish of a man confronting the collapse of his last hope. But as Lucas sat in the dirt, breathing heavily and fighting back tears of rage and despair, his engineering mind began to assert itself over his emotional devastation. 3 months of investigation had taught him that nothing in this case was as simple as it appeared. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to get those coordinates to him. Why would they lead him to an empty clearing unless there was something here that wasn't immediately obvious? Forcing himself to his feet, Lucas began a methodical examination of the abandoned campsite. He kicked through piles of decomposing leaves, examined every rusted piece of metal, every scrap of fabric that might once have been equipment. Most of it was clearly worthless, the kind of debris that accumulates wherever humans temporarily inhabit wild places. But then, partially buried beneath a fallen log thick with moss and crawling with insects, something caught his eye. It was metallic, about the size of a thick paperback book, with what appeared to be a short antenna protruding from one corner. Lucas's pulse quickened as he brushed away the accumulated forest debris. It was a satellite phone, but not the sleek modern kind he was familiar with. This device looked like it belonged in a museum of telecommunications history. Blocky, military-grade construction with a case that had once been olive green, but was now mottled with rust and corrosion. The LCD screen was cracked, spiderwebbed with damage that rendered it completely unreadable. Several buttons had fallen out entirely, leaving only empty holes in the keypad. Lucas lifted the device, feeling its surprising weight in his hands. Water damage had clearly destroyed any hope of functionality. He could hear liquid sloshing inside when he tilted it. The antenna was bent at an odd angle, and corrosion had eaten through the metal in several places. To anyone else, it would have been nothing more than electronic garbage, the kind of thing hikers occasionally left behind when their equipment failed in the unforgiving environment of the jungle. But Lucas was not anyone else. His years of software engineering had given him an intimate understanding of how electronic devices were constructed, how they could fail, and most importantly, how they could sometimes be salvaged even when they appeared completely destroyed. As he turned the ruined phone over in his hands, his trained eye began to identify components that might have survived the obvious external damage. The battery compartment had corroded completely, green oxidation coating everything in sight. The main circuit board was clearly destroyed, its delicate traces dissolved by months or years of exposure to moisture. But phones like this were designed with multiple layers of protection for their most critical components. And Lucas knew that data storage elements were often the most resilient parts of any electronic system. Using his multi-tool, he began the delicate process of disassembly. The screws had rusted solid, requiring careful application of penetrating oil and patience to remove without stripping. As he worked, Insects buzzed around his head, drawn by his sweat, but he ignored them completely. His world had narrowed to this single task, this methodical excavation of a device that might contain nothing at all. The outer case came apart reluctantly, revealing the water-damaged chaos within. Circuits were green with corrosion. Plastic components had warped from heat and humidity, and everything reeked of decay. But there, nestled in a specially designed cavity that had provided extra protection from the elements, was a tiny silver rectangle no larger than his thumbnail. A memory chip. Lucas held it up to the filtered sunlight streaming through the canopy, his hands trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and sudden, overwhelming hope. The chip appeared intact, its metallic surface free of the corrosion that had claimed the rest of the device. It was possible, just possible, that whoever had hidden this phone in the jungle had known that this single component might survive long after everything else had failed. His intuition, sharpened by months of desperate searching, screamed that this was no coincidence. Someone had wanted this chip to be found, had counted on a searcher persistent enough and knowledgeable enough to look beyond the obvious destruction to find the treasure hidden within. As he carefully placed the chip in a waterproof pocket of his backpack, Lucas felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Genuine hope, tempered by the hard-won wisdom that in this jungle of mysteries, nothing was ever as simple as it appeared. The journey back to civilization felt like emerging from a fever dream into a nightmare of bureaucratic indifference. Lucas's body ached from the jungle expedition. His shoulders bore deep purple bruises from his backpack straps. His hands were crosshatched with healing cuts from thorns and branches, and his feet had developed a limp from the persistent blisters that had never quite healed. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the burning urgency that drove him toward the police station. The tiny memory chip secured in a waterproof pouch that he checked obsessively every few minutes. The regional police headquarters stood like a concrete monument to institutional authority, its brutalist architecture designed to intimidate rather than welcome. The building's facade was stained with years of tropical rain, dark streaks running down the gray walls like tears of neglect. Security cameras mounted at every corner tracked Lucas's approach with mechanical precision, their lenses following his movement, like the eyes of predators sizing up potential prey. Inside, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the humid heat that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. The reception area reeked of disinfectant and stale cigarette smoke, despite the prominent no-smoking signs posted throughout. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead with the irregular rhythm of electrical systems pushed beyond their limits, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look sickly and suspicious. Lucas had called ahead, demanding an immediate meeting with Commander Ramirez regarding new evidence in his family's case. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman whose bored expression suggested she had heard every sob story imaginable, directed him to wait on a plastic chair that had been designed by someone who clearly hated the human spine. For 47 minutes, Lucas checked his watch obsessively. He sat in that chair, watching officers come and go with the casual arrogance of people who had grown comfortable with their power. When Commander Ramirez finally appeared, his presence filled the room like a gathering storm cloud. He was a man who had clearly once been impressive, broad shoulders and commanding height, but years of desk work and comfortable corruption had softened his edges. His uniform was immaculate, each crease sharp enough to cut paper, each button polished to mirror brightness. But his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had learned to view human suffering as a statistical inconvenience, rather than a tragedy requiring justice. Officer Castro flanked him like a loyal shadow, smaller and more nervous in demeanor, but equally dismissive in attitude. Castro's uniform never quite seemed to fit properly. His collar was always slightly askew, his badge positioned just off-center, as if he were playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. His eyes darted constantly between Lucas and his superior, seeking approval for every expression that crossed his face. The interview room they led him to was a masterpiece of psychological intimidation. Windowless walls painted an institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who entered. The table was bolted to the floor, scarred with the desperate scratches of countless previous occupants. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting sharp shadows that made every face look sinister. Lucas placed the memory chip on the table between them, with the reverence of a man presenting the crown jewels. His hands shook slightly as he explained his discovery, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate hope. He described the coordinates, the abandoned campsite, the methodical process of extracting the chip from the ruined satellite phone. Every detail spilled out of him like water from a broken dam. He had been holding this story inside for so long that it felt like salvation to finally share it with someone in authority. But as he spoke, he watched the expressions on the officers' faces shift from feigned interest to barely concealed irritation. Commander Ramirez leaned back in his chair with the exaggerated patience of someone humoring a particularly persistent child. His fingers drummed against the metal table with increasing tempo, each tap sounding like a judge's gavel dismissing Lucas's hopes. When Lucas finished his account, silence settled over the room like dust on a grave. Ramirez picked up the chip between his thumb and forefinger, holding it up to the harsh light as if examining a particularly unimpressive insect. He turned it over several times, his expression growing more dismissive with each rotation. The chip, so precious to Lucas, looked impossibly small and insignificant in the commander's thick fingers. Officer Castro shifted in his chair, the plastic creaking under his weight. His eyes never quite met Lucas's, instead focusing on points just past his left shoulder, as if Lucas were transparent. When he did speak, his voice carried the bored tone of someone reciting lines from a script he had performed too many times before. The dismissal was swift and brutal. Commander Ramirez's words cut through Lucas's remaining hope like a blade through silk. The chip was declared worthless, probably from an old surveying device, possibly military surplus from decades past. Nothing more than electronic debris that could have been dropped by any of 1,000 different people who had passed through the jungle over the years. The case remained closed, the evidence meaningless, the search for his family officially over. Lucas felt the room spinning around him as his last thread of hope was severed with bureaucratic efficiency. The fluorescent light above seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and he could taste copper in his mouth, the metallic flavor of dreams dying violent deaths. His hands clenched involuntarily, fingernails digging crescent-shaped wounds into his palms. But something else was happening beneath the surface of this official dismissal. Lucas's engineering mind, trained to detect patterns and anomalies, began picking up subtle inconsistencies in the officer's behavior. Commander Ramirez's dismissal had been too quick, too definitive. A truly indifferent official might have at least pretended to have the chip analyzed, and Officer Castro's nervous energy seemed less like boredom and more like anxiety, the fidgeting of someone hiding something important. The meeting ended with handshakes that felt like acts of betrayal. Commander Ramirez's grip was firm and dry, the handshake of a politician accustomed to manipulating public perception. Officer Castro's hand was damp with perspiration, and he broke eye contact the moment their palms touched. They escorted Lucas to the door with the efficient courtesy of funeral directors, their smiles never reaching their eyes. Outside the police station, the afternoon sun felt like a physical assault after the air-conditioned interior. Lucas stood on the concrete steps, surrounded by the chaos of urban traffic and street vendors, feeling more alone than he had even in the depths of the jungle. The memory chip, returned to him with such casual dismissal, burned like a coal in his pocket. The city around him seemed to pulse with indifferent life. Cars honking in endless traffic jams, vendors calling out their wares in voices hoarse from constant use, children playing in streets that reeked of exhaust fumes and cooking oil. But Lucas heard none of it. His world had narrowed to a single, terrible certainty. The men charged with finding his family were actively working to ensure they stayed lost. It was then that he noticed the figure watching him from across the street. At first glance, the man appeared to be just another pedestrian waiting for the traffic light to change. But something in his posture, the deliberate way he avoided direct eye contact while clearly observing Lucas, set off alarm bells in Lucas's increasingly paranoid mind. The man was perhaps 40 years old, with the lean build of someone who had never allowed comfort to soften his edges. His clothing was carefully unremarkable: khaki pants, a plain white shirt, shoes that had been expensive once but were now showing signs of heavy use. But his eyes, when they occasionally flicked toward Lucas, held an intelligence that seemed at odds with his deliberately mundane appearance. When the traffic light changed, the man crossed the street with purposeful strides, approaching Lucas with the measured pace of someone who had planned this encounter carefully. As he drew closer, Lucas could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting into too many sunrises and staying awake through too many dangerous nights. The stranger's face was familiar in a way that Lucas couldn't immediately place, like a half-remembered dream or a photograph glimpsed briefly in a newspaper. When recognition finally dawned, it came with a flood of mixed emotions. This was Detective Torres, a name that had appeared in several newspaper articles about police corruption investigations. His reputation was that of a rare, honest cop in a department where integrity was often seen as a career-limiting disability. Torres positioned himself carefully, close enough to speak without being overheard, but far enough away to maintain the illusion of a chance encounter. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, cataloging potential threats with the practiced paranoia of someone who had made powerful enemies. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and urgent, carrying the weight of secrets that could destroy careers and end lives. The detective's words confirmed Lucas's worst suspicions about Commander Ramirez and Officer Castro. But more than that, they offered something Lucas had begun to believe no longer existed: the possibility of an ally within the corrupt system that had failed his family so completely. Torres spoke of his own investigation into missing persons cases, of patterns that suggested something far more sinister than simple police incompetence. But trust, Torres explained, was a luxury neither of them could afford. He had been watching Lucas, evaluating his determination and his discretion. Too many good people had died because they had trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. If Lucas wanted his help, he would have to prove himself worthy of the risk Torres was taking by even approaching him. The detective's final words hung in the humid air between them like a challenge and a promise combined. His eyes, when they finally met Lucas's directly, held the steady gaze of someone who had stared into the abyss of human corruption and chosen to keep fighting anyway. The choice he offered was simple in concept, but terrifying in its implications. Trust a stranger who claimed to be different from the rest, or continue alone against forces that had already proven their willingness to sacrifice innocent lives for their own benefit. As Torres melted back into the crowd with the same deliberate unremarkability with which he had approached, Lucas was left standing on the police station steps, holding a decision that would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of Sophia and Isabella as well. The memory chip in his pocket felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that it might be the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement, if he could find someone brave enough and trustworthy enough to help him unlock its secrets. The safe house that Detective Torres led him to was a testament to decades of careful paranoia. Hidden in the maze of narrow streets that comprised the city's oldest district, it occupied the second floor of a building that had once housed a printing press, but now served as a front for Torres's unofficial investigations. The stairs leading up creaked with age and moisture damage, each step announcing their presence to anyone who might be listening. But Torres moved with practiced silence, his feet finding the spots where the wood remained solid, avoiding the groans and squeaks that would betray their location. The room itself was Spartanly functional, furnished with the kind of equipment that suggested serious intent rather than casual interest. A massive wooden table dominated the center space, its surface scarred with years of use and covered with maps, photographs, and case files that spoke to the scope of Torres's private war against corruption. Multiple computer monitors flickered in the dim light, their screens displaying encrypted communication channels and database searches that would have been impossible to conduct from any official police terminal. The windows had been covered with heavy blackout curtains, but thin slices of late afternoon sunlight still managed to penetrate the edges, creating narrow golden beams that danced with dust motes and cigarette smoke. The air smelled of strong coffee, electronic equipment running hot, and the particular mustiness that accumulated in spaces where secrets were kept and desperate plans were hatched. Lucas sat in a metal folding chair that had been positioned facing the largest monitor, his hands trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation that made it difficult to hold steady objects. The memory chip looked impossibly small in Torres's weathered fingers as the detective inserted it into a specialized reader that hummed to life with electronic purpose. For several minutes, nothing happened except the soft whirring of cooling fans and the occasional click of Torres's fingers dancing across the keyboard, with the fluid expertise of someone who had spent years coaxing secrets from reluctant machines. The first indication that they had found something significant came as a series of numbers scrolling down the screen. Longitude and latitude coordinates that painted a digital trail across the jungle terrain. But these weren't random waypoints or casual navigation markers. The timestamps revealed a methodical progression, a carefully documented journey that recorded not just locations but precise times, elevations, and even weather conditions. Torres leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional interest to something approaching awe. He had seen evidence hidden in many forms over the years, but never anything quite so systematically comprehensive. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that this digital breadcrumb trail would survive whatever fate awaited them in the jungle's green depths. But it was when Torres activated the audio playback function that the true horror of the situation began to unfold. The first recording was almost mundane. Sophia's voice, bright and cheerful, describing the beauty of the jungle canopy to Isabella. Her words bubbled with the enthusiasm of someone experiencing natural wonder for the first time, punctuated by Isabella's delighted giggles as she spotted exotic birds through her binoculars. Lucas closed his eyes and let his wife's voice wash over him like a benediction. For the first time in months, he could hear her not as a memory filtered through grief and desperation, but as she had actually been, alive, happy, sharing an adventure with their daughter. The sound was so vivid, so immediate, that he could almost smell the jungle humidity and feel the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. But as the recordings progressed chronologically, subtle changes began to emerge in Sophia's tone. Her observations became more pointed, her voice carrying undertones of concern that someone less familiar with her speech patterns might have missed entirely. She began commenting on inconsistencies in their guide's behavior, noting how he seemed to avoid certain trails, and grew nervous when questioned about local wildlife. The transformation from vacation documentation to survival intelligence happened gradually, then suddenly. Sophia's voice dropped to whispers as she began recording in secret, describing overheard conversations between their guide and men who emerged from the jungle like armed phantoms. Her words became clipped and urgent as she documented license plates, physical descriptions, and fragments of conversation that revealed the true nature of their supposed ecotourism adventure. Lucas felt his stomach turn to ice as Sophia's whispered words painted a picture of systematic deception. The tour company wasn't simply cutting corners on safety or operating without proper permits. It was a carefully constructed facade for something far more sinister. Their family vacation had been a cover story, their presence in the jungle part of a larger operation that trafficked in rare animals destined for private collectors who paid premium prices for creatures that officially didn't exist in captivity. The audio quality varied dramatically from recording to recording. Sometimes Sophia's voice came through clearly, captured during moments when she could speak freely. Other times, the microphone picked up only fragments of whispered words, punctuated by the sounds of jungle insects and distant machinery that suggested industrial activity in places where no industry should exist. But it was the final series of recordings that transformed Lucas's grief into something approaching rage. Sophia's voice, normally so controlled and analytical, carried the unmistakable tremor of someone confronting their own mortality. She spoke in code, using references that only Lucas would understand, describing their captors' routines and the layout of the facility where they were being held. The last clear recording was perhaps 30 seconds long, but it contained more devastating information than hours of official police reports. Sophia's voice, barely audible above the ambient jungle noise, described seeing shipping containers marked with corporate logos, armed guards speaking multiple languages, and most horrifying of all, other families who appeared to have been held captive for months or possibly years. But it was Sophia's final words that broke Lucas's heart and rebuilt it simultaneously into something harder and more determined. Her voice, thick with tears but steadied by maternal resolve, carried a message meant specifically for him. She had been leaving this trail from the beginning, she explained, not because she expected to escape, but because she knew that if anyone could follow the breadcrumbs she was scattering, it would be the man who had built his career on solving seemingly impossible puzzles. The recording ended with sounds that Lucas's imagination filled with horrors he couldn't bear to contemplate fully. Sophia's sharp intake of breath, footsteps approaching rapidly, and then silence that stretched like an eternity. Torres sat motionless in his chair, his face reflecting the grim satisfaction of a man whose worst suspicions had been confirmed beyond doubt. He had investigated dozens of missing persons cases over the years, each one dismissed by his superiors as isolated incidents or unfortunate accidents. But the evidence on this memory chip revealed something far more organized and extensive. A network that operated with the kind of systematic efficiency that required protection from the highest levels of local government. The GPS coordinates painted a map of operations that stretched across hundreds of square miles of supposedly protected jungle. The timestamps revealed patterns of movement that suggested regular supply runs, scheduled pickups, and a level of organization that could only exist with insider knowledge of law enforcement patrol schedules and government inspection routines. Lucas found himself experiencing a strange form of emotional whiplash as relief and horror battled for dominance in his consciousness. On one hand, he finally had proof that Sophia and Isabella were alive, or had been alive when the last recording was made. But that knowledge came paired with the devastating realization that their ordeal was far worse than his most paranoid imaginings had suggested. The transformation in Lucas's mindset was almost physical in its intensity. For months, he had been a grieving father driven by hope and desperation. But as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, he evolved into something harder and more focused. His engineering mind began analyzing the data with cold precision, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities in the criminal network's operations. Torres watched this transformation with professional interest. He had seen grief turn to determination countless times, but rarely with such systematic intensity. Lucas was no longer simply a man searching for his missing family. He had become a weapon aimed at the heart of a criminal enterprise that had operated in shadows for too long. The detective began pulling up files from his own investigation, cross-referencing the coordinates from Sophia's chip with missing persons reports that stretched back years. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its implications. Families, researchers, journalists, and activists who had ventured into certain areas of the jungle had vanished at rates that defied statistical probability. All of their disappearances had been dismissed as accidents or misadventures, their cases closed with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested official indifference rather than investigative thoroughness. As the evidence mounted, Lucas felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The desperate hope that had sustained him through months of searching crystallized into something far more dangerous, a systematic determination to dismantle the network that had stolen his family. The memory chip in Torres's computer wasn't just evidence of his wife and daughter's survival. It was a blueprint for war against an enemy that had underestimated the resolve of a father who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The return journey into the jungle felt like descending into the belly of a beast that had already tasted their fear. This time, Lucas and Torres moved with the calculated precision of hunters, rather than the desperate urgency of searchers. The memory chip's coordinates had been transferred to military-grade GPS units that Torres had acquired through channels that didn't officially exist, their screens glowing softly in the pre-dawn darkness, as the two men prepared for what they both understood might be a one-way expedition. Torres had transformed in the hours since they'd decoded Sophia's recordings. Gone was the cautious detective who had approached Lucas with careful words and measured trust. In his place stood a man who moved with the fluid efficiency of someone preparing for war. His backpack contained equipment that spoke to serious intent. Night vision goggles, encrypted communication devices, medical supplies that went well beyond basic first aid, and other items wrapped in waterproof packages that he didn't offer to explain. The jungle welcomed them back with the same indifferent hostility it showed all intruders. But this time, Lucas found himself reading its moods and rhythms with an awareness born of desperation-sharpened senses. Every sound carried potential meaning. The sudden silence of insects might indicate human presence. The call of a particular bird could signal danger or safe passage. His urban, softened reflexes had been honed by months of searching into something approaching competence in this green cathedral of secrets. They moved primarily during the gray hours before dawn and after dusk, when the jungle's natural rhythms provided cover for their passage. During the blazing heat of midday, they rested in whatever shade they could find, their bodies pressed against tree trunks that seemed to pulse with the forest's ancient heartbeat. Torres had taught Lucas to recognize the signs of human passage that weren't immediately obvious. A branch bent at an unnatural angle, disturbed patterns in fallen leaves, the particular way certain plants recovered from being stepped on. On the second day, following coordinates that Sophia had recorded during what must have been moments of unimaginable terror, they discovered evidence of the criminal network's infrastructure. Hidden beneath camouflage netting that would have been invisible from any aerial surveillance were solar panels and communication equipment sophisticated enough to maintain contact with operations spanning continents. Power cables ran through hollow logs, their insulation carefully protected from the moisture and insects that destroyed most electrical systems in the jungle environment. But it was on the third morning that they made the discovery that changed everything. Lucas had been examining a GPS waypoint that corresponded to one of Sophia's most urgent recordings, when Torres suddenly motioned for complete silence. Through the vegetation ahead came sounds that didn't belong to the jungle's natural symphony. Human movement, labored breathing, and what might have been whispered words in Spanish. The man they found huddled beneath a makeshift shelter of branches and plastic sheeting was barely recognizable as human. His clothing hung in tatters, revealing skin that bore the marks of weeks spent fighting the jungle's relentless assault. Infected cuts covered his arms and legs, some showing the telltale signs of serious sepsis. His hair had grown wild and matted, framing a face that bore the hollow expression of someone who had stared too long into moral abysses that ordinary people never had to contemplate. But despite the physical deterioration, Lucas recognized him immediately from photographs in the official police reports. This was Mateo Rodriguez, the guide who had supposedly drowned in the same flood that had claimed Lucas's family. His presence here, alive but obviously traumatized, confirmed every suspicion that had been building in Lucas's mind about the extent of official complicity in the cover-up. Mateo's reaction to their approach spoke to months of living in constant terror. He scrambled backward through the undergrowth with the desperate energy of a cornered animal, his movements hampered by injuries that had clearly never received proper medical attention. His eyes darted between Lucas and Torres with the paranoid assessment of someone who had learned that survival depended on correctly identifying threats before they became lethal. The recognition, when it came, transformed Mateo's expression from fear to something far more complex. Shame, relief, and desperate hope warring for dominance across features that had been aged beyond their years by experiences no civilian should endure. His body language shifted from defensive to supplicating, hands raised not in surrender, but in a gesture that seemed to beg for understanding rather than punishment. Lucas felt rage building in his chest like pressure in a boiler approaching explosion. Here was the man who had led his family into captivity, who had been present during their transformation from tourists into victims. Every rational instinct screamed for vengeance, for the satisfaction of finally having someone tangible to blame for months of anguish. His hands clenched into fists that trembled with the effort of restraint. But Torres, with the practiced eye of someone who had interviewed countless victims and perpetrators, read the situation with professional clarity. Mateo's injuries weren't the kind that resulted from fleeing through jungle terrain. They bore the systematic patterns of interrogation and punishment. The scars on his wrists spoke to extended periods of restraint, while older marks suggested that his cooperation with the criminal network hadn't been voluntary. As the truth emerged through Mateo's halting explanations, delivered in a mixture of Spanish and broken English that spoke to extreme emotional distress, the nature of his involvement became horrifyingly clear. The criminals hadn't simply recruited him as a guide. They had manufactured his compliance through threats against his elderly mother and teenage sister, whose photographs they had shown him in explicit detail before describing exactly what would happen to them if he failed to perform his assigned role. Mateo's account painted a picture of systematic coercion that extended far beyond simple criminal recruitment. The organization operated with the ruthless efficiency of a military unit, complete with intelligence networks that tracked the movements and vulnerabilities of everyone in the region. They knew which guides had family members who could be threatened, which officials could be bought or intimidated, and which tourists possessed the kind of resources that made them valuable commodities rather than simple victims. The guide's description of the trafficking operation revealed a scope that dwarfed even Torres's most pessimistic estimates. The network didn't simply capture and sell exotic animals. It operated as a full-service criminal enterprise that supplied private collectors, illegal research facilities, and black market dealers with everything from endangered species to human subjects for purposes that Mateo couldn't bring himself to describe in detail. But it was when Mateo began describing the location where he had last seen Sofia and Isabella that Lucas felt his world narrow to a single point of focus. The facility wasn't simply a holding area for captured animals. It was a sophisticated operation that processed and prepared shipments destined for buyers around the world. The GPS coordinates that Mateo provided matched exactly with the final location data that Sofia had managed to record on her chip. The trafficking post occupied a section of jungle that had been systematically cleared and developed with infrastructure that spoke to years of investment and planning. Concrete bunkers housed climate-controlled storage areas for sensitive cargo, while heavy equipment suggested the ability to construct landing strips for aircraft that didn't appear on any official flight manifests. Security cameras and motion sensors created overlapping fields of surveillance that would detect any unauthorized approach long before intruders could threaten the operation. Mateo's knowledge of the facility's routines and vulnerabilities came at a price that was written across every line of his traumatized features. He had been forced to witness the processing of human cargo alongside exotic animals, had seen families separated and children prepared for transportation to destinations that existed only in the nightmares of those who understood the full scope of international human trafficking networks. But perhaps most horrifying was Mateo's description of the facility's relationship with local law enforcement. Regular visits from uniformed officers weren't raids or investigations. They were business meetings where protection was purchased and information was exchanged. The very people who should have been working to rescue Lucas's family were instead ensuring that their captors could operate without interference. As Mateo's story unfolded, Lucas found his rage transforming into something colder and more focused. This wasn't simply about rescuing Sophia and Isabella anymore. It was about dismantling a network that had perverted every institution that should have protected innocent people. The guide's offer to lead them to the trafficking post came with the implicit understanding that success would require methods that went far beyond what any legitimate law enforcement operation could sanction. The alliance that formed between the three men was forged not in trust, but in shared desperation. Lucas needed Mateo's knowledge of the jungle and the criminal network's operations. Torres required local expertise to navigate both the terrain and the complex web of corruption that had allowed the trafficking operation to flourish. And Mateo, haunted by months of complicity in crimes that violated every moral boundary he had once recognized, saw in their mission a chance for redemption that might allow him to sleep without nightmares for the first time in months. The final phase of their journey took them through terrain that seemed designed by nature to discourage human presence. Ancient trees rose like cathedral pillars toward a canopy so thick that midday resembled twilight, their massive trunks providing shelter for creatures that existed nowhere else on Earth. The air itself seemed alive with moisture, and the chemical signatures of plant life engaged in constant warfare for survival resources. But beneath the jungle's natural majesty lay evidence of human contamination that spoke to the scope of the criminal operation they were approaching. Hidden supply caches contained equipment and provisions that could sustain operations for months without resupply. Concealed observation posts provided surveillance coverage of approaches that weren't marked on any official maps. And everywhere, carefully camouflaged but visible to eyes that knew what to look for, were the signs of an infrastructure that existed in the shadows between legitimate civilization and the criminal enterprises that fed on its vulnerabilities. As they drew closer to their destination, guided by coordinates that Sophia had purchased with unimaginable courage and Mateo's knowledge earned through months of forced complicity, Lucas felt the last vestiges of the desperate father he had been falling away. In his place emerged something harder and more focused, a man who understood that some battles could only be won by those willing to descend into the same moral darkness as their enemies, armed with nothing but the certainty that love could survive where justice had failed. The final approach to the trafficking compound required them to traverse terrain that seemed designed by malevolent forces to test human endurance beyond its breaking point. For 3 hours before dawn, they crawled through undergrowth so dense that visibility extended no more than arm's length in any direction. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid the motion sensors that Mateo described with the precision of someone who had helped install them under threat of death. Their clothing, already torn and stained from weeks in the jungle, became further shredded by thorns that seemed to reach out with deliberate malice. The hill that provided their first glimpse of the compound rose through layers of vegetation like a green monument to nature's indifference to human suffering. Ancient trees, their trunks wider than small buildings, created a natural watchtower that had probably served similar purposes for centuries before modern criminals discovered its strategic value. Climbing to a vantage point required navigating root systems that formed natural ladders, each handhold tested carefully to ensure it could support their weight, without breaking and alerting the guards below to their presence. From their elevated position, the scope of the criminal operation spread before them like a vision from the darkest imagination. What Mateo had described as a trafficking post revealed itself to be a sophisticated industrial complex that had been carved from the jungle with the systematic efficiency of a military installation. Concrete buildings formed geometric patterns that spoke to careful planning and substantial financial investment, their surfaces painted in camouflage patterns that would render them invisible to aerial surveillance. The facility's layout revealed the cold logic of commerce applied to human misery and environmental destruction. A series of interconnected warehouses dominated the central area, their loading docks oriented toward a cleared strip that could accommodate aircraft large enough to transport cargo containers across international borders. Smaller buildings, arranged with mathematical precision around the perimeter, served functions that Lucas's engineering mind could identify even from a distance. Generator housing, communication centers, administrative offices, and what appeared to be living quarters for security personnel. But it was the holding areas that transformed Lucas's analytical assessment into visceral horror. Rows of cages, some large enough to contain vehicles, others barely sufficient for a single human being, stretched across the compound, like a grotesque parody of a zoo. The morning light revealed movement within many of these enclosures, shadows that could have been rare animals or human captives, their true nature impossible to determine from the hilltop observation point. Lucas pressed Torres's military-grade binoculars against his eyes with such force that the rubber eyepieces left indentations in his skin. Through the magnified lenses, details that had been mere suggestions became heartbreaking reality. He could see guards moving between the cages with the casual indifference of farmers tending livestock, checking inventory that included both exotic animals and human beings with the same systematic efficiency. And then, in a moment that stopped his heart and restarted it with violent force, he saw them. Sophia and Isabella occupied a cage near the center of the compound, their presence unmistakable despite the distance and the months of captivity that had changed their appearances. Sophia's once vibrant hair had grown long and unkempt, her posture reflecting the constant vigilance of someone who had learned to sleep while remaining alert for danger. Isabella, heartbreakingly small in the oversized cage, seemed to have aged years in the months since their disappearance. The sight of his family, alive but imprisoned like animals awaiting sale to the highest bidder, ignited something primal in Lucas's chest. His hands began to shake with a rage so pure and focused that it threatened to overwhelm the careful planning that had brought them this far. Every fiber of his being screamed for immediate action, for a desperate charge down the hillside that would reunite him with his family regardless of the tactical impossibility of such an approach. But Torres, with the steady hand of someone who had channeled similar emotions into effective action countless times, placed a calming grip on Lucas's shoulder. His whispered words carried the weight of professional experience applied to personal vendetta. They had one chance to rescue Sophia and Isabella along with the other victims, and success depended on precision rather than passion. The plan that emerged from their hilltop conference combined Lucas's technical expertise with Torres's tactical knowledge, and Mateo's intimate familiarity with the compound's routines and vulnerabilities. Lucas had brought equipment from his engineering background: signal jammers, electronic surveillance detectors, and communication devices that could operate on frequencies the criminals wouldn't monitor. Torres contributed weapons, explosives, and the kind of specialized gear that suggested access to resources far beyond what any legitimate police investigation could officially sanction. Mateo's contribution was perhaps the most valuable, and certainly the most painful. His forced participation in the compound's operations had given him knowledge of guard rotations, security protocols, and the precise timing of activities that could provide windows of opportunity. But sharing this information required him to relive months of complicity that had stripped away every illusion he had once held about his own moral boundaries. The compound's security relied heavily on technology rather than human vigilance, a vulnerability that Lucas's engineering background made him uniquely qualified to exploit. The criminals had invested heavily in motion sensors, communication networks, and tracking systems that could coordinate responses to threats across the facility's extensive perimeter. But these same systems that made the compound nearly impregnable also created single points of failure that could cascade into complete operational breakdown if targeted with sufficient precision. Lucas assembled his jamming device with the focused concentration of a surgeon performing life-saving surgery. The equipment, cobbled together from components that individually seemed harmless, but collectively represented a weapon capable of bringing down the entire facility's electronic infrastructure, reflected months of preparation for a confrontation he had hoped would never be necessary. As the afternoon sun reached its zenith, and the compound below settled into its daily rhythm of criminal commerce, The three men began their descent through vegetation that seemed to actively resist their passage. Every step required careful placement to avoid noise that would alert the perimeter sensors, every movement calculated to take advantage of natural cover that could conceal their approach from both electronic and human surveillance. The final approach required them to traverse an open area that felt like crossing a minefield in broad daylight. Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he was certain the sound would betray their position to anyone within 100 yards. The device in his backpack, calibrated to disable every electronic system within a quarter-mile radius, felt like a ticking bomb that could explode at any moment and alert their enemies to the coming assault. When Lucas finally activated the jamming system, the effect was immediate and devastating. The compound's electronic infrastructure, designed to function as an integrated network, began failing in cascading waves that spread through the facility like a digital plague. Communication systems that coordinated guard movements fell silent. Motion sensors that protected the perimeter ceased their vigilant monitoring, and tracking devices that monitored both captives and valuable animal cargo stopped transmitting their vital signs to the central command center. The chaos that erupted throughout the compound exceeded even Lucas's most optimistic projections. Guards accustomed to depending on electronic coordination found themselves isolated and confused, unable to communicate with their colleagues or receive instructions from their commanders. The criminals who had felt secure behind layers of technological protection suddenly discovered that their entire defensive strategy had been reduced to useless metal and plastic by a man whose only weapons were knowledge and desperation. Torres's team, positioned at strategic points around the compound's perimeter, moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit that had trained for exactly this scenario. Their assault unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of violence, each movement designed to maximize the confusion created by the electronic blackout, while minimizing the risk to the innocent victims trapped within the facility. The firefight that erupted across the compound was brief but intensely violent. The criminals, caught off guard by an attack that had disabled their primary defensive advantages, found themselves engaged with opponents who possessed superior training, better equipment, and most importantly, moral certainty about the righteousness of their cause. Within minutes, the sounds of gunfire were replaced by the shouts of surrender from traffickers who had suddenly realized that their profitable enterprise had become a death trap. Lucas moved through the compound with the single-minded focus of a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. The cage holding Sophia and Isabella was secured with locks that his engineering knowledge allowed him to disable in seconds, the mechanisms yielding to techniques he had learned during countless hours of studying security systems that might stand between him and his family. The reunion that followed defied every romantic notion Lucas had harbored about finding his family. Sophia and Isabella were alive, but they bore the psychological and physical scars of months spent as cargo in a criminal enterprise that had stripped away their humanity, along with their freedom. Their eyes reflected trauma that would require years to heal, their movements carrying the cautious hesitation of people who had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. But beneath the damage inflicted by their captivity, Lucas could see the fundamental essence of the people he loved burning with undiminished brightness. Sophia's first coherent words were questions about his safety, rather than expressions of relief about her rescue. Isabella's arms, when they finally wrapped around his neck, carried the desperate strength of a child who had never stopped believing that her father would find her. The arrival of Commander Ramirez and Officer Castro, sirens wailing and lights flashing in a display of official authority, represented the final act in a drama that had begun with their dismissal of Lucas's initial pleas for help. They approached the compound with the confident swagger of law enforcement officers responding to a successful operation, their uniforms pressed and their badges polished to mirror brightness. But Torres, with the grim satisfaction of someone whose patient investigation had finally yielded irrefutable evidence, greeted them not as colleagues, but as criminals whose complicity had been documented with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized every aspect of the rescue operation. The handcuffs that clicked around their wrists carried the weight of justice delayed but not denied, their protests and denials falling on ears that had heard too many lies to be deceived by any more. As the sun set over the jungle compound that had housed so much suffering, Lucas held his family with the desperate gratitude of someone who had stared into the abyss of loss and emerged victorious through a combination of love, determination, and the kind of courage that ordinary people discovered only when faced with circumstances that demanded everything they had to give. The criminal network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable lay in ruins around them, brought down by the relentless pursuit of a father who had refused to accept that some battles couldn't be won. The hospital room existed in stark contrast to the green hell that had consumed months of Lucas's life. Its sterile white walls and antiseptic smell representing a return to civilization that felt almost surreal after the primal brutality of the jungle compound. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical reliability, their steady illumination a comforting replacement for the unpredictable interplay of shadow and sunlight that had filtered through the forest canopy. The air conditioning maintained a constant temperature that felt like luxury after weeks of oppressive humidity and the ever-present threat of tropical storms. Lucas sat in a visitor's chair that had been designed for comfort rather than mere functionality, its padded surfaces a welcome relief for a body that had grown accustomed to sleeping on jungle floors and makeshift shelters. His clothes, finally clean after industrial-strength hospital laundering, still bore faint stains that would serve as permanent reminders of his journey through darkness toward redemption. His hands, no longer trembling with the constant tension of survival mode, rested peacefully on the chair's armrests as he watched Sophia sleep in the hospital bed nearby. The medical equipment surrounding Sophia's bed painted a picture of recovery rather than crisis. Monitors displaying steady heartbeats and normal blood pressure. IV drips providing nutrients to rebuild strength depleted by months of inadequate food and constant stress. Her face, partially obscured by oxygen tubes that helped her breathe more easily after respiratory infections contracted in the humid prison conditions, showed the peaceful expression of someone finally able to rest without fear of what morning might bring. Isabella occupied the smaller bed positioned near the window, her recovery progressing with the remarkable resilience that seemed unique to children who had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged with their essential spirit intact. The teddy bear clutched in her arms was new, purchased from the hospital gift shop to replace the countless treasures lost during her captivity. But her grip on it carried the desperate intensity of someone who had learned not to take comfort for granted. The sounds of the hospital, distant conversations between medical staff, the soft chiming of elevator arrivals, the whispered discussions of families dealing with their own crises, created a symphony of normalcy that felt almost overwhelming after months of jungle silence broken only by the sounds of danger and desperation. Lucas found himself listening to these mundane noises with the appreciation of someone who had feared he might never hear them again. Detective Torres appeared in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that characterized all his movements, his presence announced by the soft knock that had become his signature during the investigation. His appearance had transformed since their jungle expedition. Gone were the camouflage clothing and tactical gear, replaced by a simple civilian shirt and pants that made him look like any other visitor navigating the hospital's corridors. But his eyes retained the watchful alertness of someone who had seen too much violence to ever fully relax. The chair that Torres pulled close to Lucas's position creaked softly under his weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere of the recovery room. His movements were careful and deliberate, mindful of the fragile peace that had finally settled over the reunited family. The folder he carried contained documentation that would transform their personal tragedy into evidence for prosecutions that would span multiple countries and jurisdictions. Torres's briefing unfolded like the final chapter of a thriller novel, revealing connections and implications that extended far beyond what any of them had imagined during their desperate search through the Amazon rainforest. The trafficking network they had dismantled represented just one node in an international operation that moved both exotic animals and human cargo through supply chains that reached into the highest levels of government and business across multiple continents. The arrest of Commander Ramirez and Officer Castro had triggered a cascade of investigations that were uncovering corruption networks spanning decades. Their cooperation with federal investigators, motivated by plea bargain negotiations, had revealed protection rackets that extended through local law enforcement, regional government officials, and international shipping companies that had knowingly transported illegal cargo disguised as legitimate commerce. The scope of the conspiracy that Sophia's courage and Lucas's determination had exposed staggered the imagination. Bank records revealed financial transactions totaling millions of dollars flowing through accounts in jurisdictions specifically chosen for their banking secrecy laws. Communication intercepts documented coordination between criminal organizations operating on different continents, their activities synchronized with the precision of multinational corporations. But perhaps most disturbing were the customer lists that had been recovered from the compound's administrative offices. Private collectors who purchased rare animals for personal zoos represented just the visible surface of a market that included research facilities conducting illegal experimentation, pharmaceutical companies seeking biological compounds not available through legitimate channels, and individuals whose purposes for acquiring human subjects defied rational comprehension. The medical examinations that Sophia and Isabella had undergone revealed the systematic nature of their treatment during captivity. While they had been spared the worst horrors that had befallen other victims, their captors had documented their physical condition and psychological profiles with the clinical detachment of researchers preparing specimens for sale. The discovery of these records provided prosecutors with evidence that would ensure even the lowest-level participants in the trafficking network faced serious prison sentences. As Torres concluded his briefing and prepared to leave the family to continue their recovery in private, Lucas felt a profound shift in his understanding of what they had accomplished. What had begun as a desperate father's search for his missing family had evolved into something far more significant: the exposure of criminal activities that had destroyed countless lives while operating under the protection of corrupted institutions. The afternoon light streaming through the hospital room's windows gradually softened as evening approached, painting the white walls in shades of gold and amber that reminded Lucas of sunset filtering through jungle canopy. The similarity might have triggered traumatic memories, but instead it brought a sense of completion, as if the cycle that had begun in darkness was finally reaching its conclusion in light. Sophia stirred in her hospital bed as consciousness returned with the gradual awareness of someone emerging from deep, healing sleep. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the artificial lighting with the careful hesitation of someone who had spent months never knowing whether awakening would bring safety or renewed danger. But when her gaze found Lucas sitting nearby, her expression transformed with relief and love that had survived every horror their captors had inflicted. The conversation that followed unfolded with the careful tenderness of two people who had experienced trauma that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. Sophia's voice, still hoarse from respiratory infections contracted during her imprisonment, carried the weight of experiences that most people could never imagine surviving. Her words painted a picture of captivity that was both more terrible and more hopeful than Lucas had dared to envision during his months of searching. Sophia's account of recognizing the corruption that had led to their capture revealed an intelligence network that had been operating under their noses for years before their fateful vacation. Her suspicions about their guide Mateo's nervous behavior had been confirmed when she observed clandestine meetings between their supposed protectors and the very criminals who would eventually imprison them. The realization that Commander Ramirez and Officer Castro were complicit in the trafficking operation had come in a moment of crystalline clarity that left no room for doubt about their family's true situation. But it was Sophia's description of her decision to create the digital breadcrumb trail that revealed the full extent of her courage and foresight. Understanding that their captors viewed them as valuable cargo rather than people to be eliminated immediately, she had recognized an opportunity to document their journey in ways that might eventually lead to rescue. Every GPS coordinate recorded, every whispered observation captured on the satellite phone's memory chip, represented a calculated risk that discovery would result in punishment or death. The knowledge that Lucas possessed the technical expertise to decode her hidden messages had given Sophia hope during the darkest moments of their captivity. When other prisoners had succumbed to despair, convinced that the world had forgotten their existence, Sophia had maintained faith that her husband's analytical mind and engineering background would eventually lead him to the clues she was leaving behind. Her voice broke with emotion as she described the moment when she realized that her plan had succeeded, when the sounds of electronic systems failing throughout the compound had announced Lucas's presence with technological precision that only he could have orchestrated. The chaos that had erupted during the rescue operation had felt like vindication of every risk she had taken to ensure their survival. As Sophia's strength gradually returned during their conversation, Lucas watched the woman he loved emerge from the trauma-induced shell that months of captivity had created around her essential spirit. Her laughter, when it finally came, carried notes of the joy that had first attracted him years earlier, proof that their captor's attempts to break her will had ultimately failed. Isabella's recovery, unfolding in parallel with her mother's, demonstrated the remarkable adaptability that had allowed her to survive experiences that would have destroyed many adults. Her whispered questions about whether the bad men were really gone forever revealed the lingering fears that would require time and therapy to fully resolve. But her excitement about simple pleasures, ice cream from the hospital cafeteria, cartoon shows on the room's television, the promise of returning to school and seeing friends again, showed that her fundamental optimism had survived intact. The discharge papers that arrived on their final morning in the hospital felt like graduation certificates, official recognition that their healing had progressed sufficiently to continue in the outside world. The medical staff who had cared for them during their recovery offered contact information for therapists specializing in trauma recovery, acknowledging that their physical healing represented only the beginning of a longer emotional journey. Walking out of the hospital together, hand in hand as they had done countless times before their ordeal, Lucas felt the weight of their shared experience settling into a new understanding of what their family had become. They were no longer simply the people they had been before their Amazon vacation. They had been transformed into survivors who had looked into the darkest aspects of human nature and emerged victorious through love, courage, and refusal to surrender hope. The sunlight that greeted them outside the hospital entrance felt warm and welcoming, free of the oppressive humidity that had made every breath a struggle during their jungle ordeal. The sounds of normal city life, traffic, conversations, children playing in a nearby park, created a symphony of normalcy that represented not an ending, but a new beginning for a family that had discovered the depths of their own resilience and the unbreakable bonds that connected them to each other. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.